Yes. Hello, everyone. A warm welcome. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah. A warm welcome in the Bali. Great to have you here in the audience and also the audience online. It's a full house, so we are very happy that you are here. My name is Eelco Bosch van Rosenthal. I'll be the moderator tonight for our guest who has done something extraordinary. She was a stand-in for Uma Thurman in the 2003 Kill Bill film at the set of Quentin Tarantino in Beijing. It's a true story because I read it in her book, On All Fronts, which we'll discuss tonight. But we won't go there for very long. We'll talk about Clarissa Ward's career, about journalism. She entered the profession, I think, 20 years ago this year, after leaving Yale University. I feel like I have to sing or make jokes. I think it's the chair. First, Clarissa was at Fox News in New York and Beirut, then based in Moscow for ABC News, then CBS, and since 2015 she has been working out of London, even though I don't think you spent that much time there, taking the job in the footsteps of Christiana Amanpour as the Chief International Correspondent for CNN. I can go through all the awards that she won, many Emmy Awards, the Peabody Award, but I'll stop there. Clarissa has been at the front line of many wars: Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Gaza, and most recently Ukraine, not just wars, other international crises as well. And tonight she's here to talk about journalism, to talk about crisis reporting, to talk about CNN, to talk about Ukraine, and to talk about everything else that comes to mind. First with me, and then there'll be plenty of time for audience questions. But first, let's please welcome to the stage Clarissa Ward. This is yours.
Guys, what a warm welcome. Thank you.
It is a warm welcome, and thank you for being here. Appreciate it. We'll talk about serious stuff tonight, but just to get, because I teased it, so just to get that out of the way, what is the Uma Thurman story?
Yeah.
And then we'll talk about other stuff.
So my father lived in Hong Kong from when I was about 14 years old, and he had a friend who was the associate producer on Kill Bill. And I just graduated from Yale, and I called this friend of my dad's, and I was like, you got to get me a job on this movie set. Come on, this is going to be the best summer job ever. And she was like, she'd never met me. She was like, come to Beijing and we'll see. So I get off the plane, she looks at me, and she's like, I think I know what you can do, but you still have to audition. So I was like, okay. And if you know what a stand-in is, it's not very glamorous at all. You literally just stand there wearing the clothes that Uma wears, and you have to be roughly the same, coloring, height, whatever, and then they get the lights ready and then they get rid of you. So I went into the audition with 5 Chinese girls, God bless them. And I was like, ladies, I got this one locked down. So that's how it happened.
Okay. Was it fun?
It was really fun for like 5 minutes, and then you realize that actually making movies is very tedious. Right. So I was excited to get to my real life, yeah.
Which is journalism right now. Just briefly, you're going to Ukraine in a couple of days.
Yeah.
Not for the first time, obviously, this year, and we'll talk about that. Now you're in Amsterdam for a few days. How's what's going on in your head if you go from one place to the other and back to the other?
Well, it wasn't easy packing for this trip because I won't be wearing these in Ukraine at all. And similarly, like, you're trying to compartmentalize in your brain, like, the events here that I was really super excited to be coming for, but then also trying to prepare for this trip, feeling some pressure to cut Amsterdam short and get to Ukraine because there's so much happening at the moment, and there's a sense that things are rapidly escalating. And so it's like having a lot of different moving parts in your head that you're constantly trying to fit them all in the same space.
Is this, however, even though that's sometimes complicated, the kind of work and life you wanted to do? You say in the book that after 9/11 you realized that being a foreign correspondent is what you wanted to do. You're not the only one. Is this what you kind of expected and wanted?
I think you never know what to expect because you have this kind of idealized notion of what this work is going to entail, and you don't understand like the depth of some of the sacrifices that you're going to have to make and the challenges that you'll have to overcome. So I do think you never get used to the idea of like sitting on stage in a beautiful city and talking to lovely people and eating a nice meal and then going to a front line days later and meeting people at like their lowest ebb and their darkest moments.
Is there a sense of guilt you need to deal with, or?
There is, but as you get a little more mature and a little wiser, I think you get better at basically, for me at a certain point, I was like, okay, I either have to choose to love life and embrace privilege and accept joy and accept love, or I can spend the rest of my life punishing myself and feeling guilt, and then I won't be able to do this work anymore because I won't have that energy and enthusiasm that you need for this work.
Right. Let's talk about the war in Ukraine, but let's first start with a clip of you in Ukraine. I think this was February 22nd, at least it was a couple of days before the invasion started, or maybe the 19th. Let's take a look.
Today, they have seen more than 30, and hitting a kindergarten is, of course, a significant escalation. No sense that this was specifically targeted, but I think what this gives you a sense of, John, is just how dangerous things can become very quickly with, you know, a lot of people believing that the Russian side is looking for a pretext to launch some kind of an incursion. And I should say, while we're here on the Ukrainian side looking at this aftermath of a pro-Russian separatist shelling, on the other side of the border, they're claiming that Ukrainian forces have been shelling them as well. And I don't know if you could hear that. There is some shelling in the distance there that we can hear. As I mentioned, less than 3 miles from the front line, but clearly a lot of fears that the situation is certainly escalating here, John.
And so, Clarissa, you know this issue better than most, as you just mentioned. It's the Russians are saying the Ukrainians are causing trouble.
John, please excuse me, but our Ukrainian military minders are asking us to move because of that shelling. So we will check in with you as soon as we can.
Clarissa Ward.
So this was, like I said, just before the invasion, but obviously the war in eastern Ukraine was going on because that's been going on for years. How is covering this war different from other wars? I assume every war is different. What's different this time?
Well, I think the big difference, and especially watching that clip, it's so stark to me. Most of us on the ground who've been doing this work a long time and who have lived in Russia, as I have, did not believe this war was going to happen. So we covered the Maidan revolution, we covered the subsequent, war in the Donbass region, but I did not believe for 1 second that Vladimir Putin was going to authorize an invasion of Ukraine.
What was the main reason for not believing so?
Because I couldn't see any potential positive outcome of that scenario for him. And I do actually still believe that Vladimir Putin is a rational actor within like the schema of his universe. But I think that I underestimated how much misinformation he is getting from his own military and various advisors in different capacities who want to present a very utopian picture to him of the state of affairs. And so I think he genuinely believed that they were going to be welcoming him in the streets, or welcoming Russian soldiers in the streets and waving white flags, and that they would all be having a Victory Day parade just a few days later, which is obviously not what happened.
Like what the Americans felt when they went into Iraq, basically.
Yes.
I mean, the sense of being...
the main difference being the Americans, they knew they were going to win militarily.
Sure.
That it wasn't going to be a tough fight.
They thought they were going to be welcomed as well.
Well, and you know what? Initially in Iraq, there were lots of people welcoming them. Not everybody, but a lot of people who were, excited about Saddam Hussein being overthrown were welcoming them. But anyone who's covered war knows that, it's easy to get caught up in the euphoria of those days when you first enter. And in Lebanon, this used to be like the big joke, because it would be like a different invading force every week. And in the beginning, the Lebanese would throw rose water and rice at them and be like, ahlan wa sahlan. And then a year later, it would be like they were getting blown up out of town again. Right. So I'm used to a certain level of capriciousness in terms of that's something that's inherent in war. But with Ukraine, the arrogance of Russia going into this and the underestimation of Ukrainian capacities, not just, I should add, by the Russians, but by the entire international community. Sure. I mean, we were being told Kyiv is going to fall in 3 days.
We believed it.
And we thought that would happen, and of course, it did not.
What also feels different this war, it's not the first war. I mean, every war has disinformation, obviously, but you have worked with Bellingcat on the Navalny investigation. Actually, Christo Grozov was in this chair talking about that investigation a couple of weeks ago.
Yes.
Does it feel different in the sense that by OSINT, social media, a video from the front line, which immediately makes it to the UK or the Netherlands. It's like this war is happening in real time, even for the people in the West, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I do.
Is it different in that sense?
It's very different. I mean, it's not the first time we've seen this. Like, actually, the first time I think I really saw that was in Syria, where like every week you would look on Friday, on Jummah, on YouTube, and there would just be thousands of videos uploaded from Dara and Daraya and all these towns and cities across the country of these like incredibly brave people who were just holding up a cell phone as these protests were being met with a hail of bullets. So we saw the power and the beginnings of the power of social media and the ability to like satellite out, and I use that word in inverted commas because obviously you're not necessarily literally using a satellite, powerful images. But that comes with a huge responsibility for a news organization because you then have to try to verify those images. And so you see this whole movement, like, which is really spearheaded by people like Bellingcat, to try to educate people in how to use open source tools, how to geolocate videos, how to go about trying to vet and verify some of this material, which is so important but very challenging for old school journalists.
Well, you write about that in the book. I think there's a Hannah Arendt quote in your book, which is I thought I had it right here, but which is about disinformation and how it basically has totalitarianism and how it basically has made your job, well, not impossible, but more and more difficult.
Yeah.
I mean, is it the fight against disinformation and the fog of war? Is it a fight journalists like yourself may lose eventually?
I don't think we're going to lose it because we just can't afford to lose it.
Right.
And so
that sounds like wishful thinking more than an actual.
I think the real danger that we face right now in our societies is that we're having so much internal divisions about, like, is this a glass or is it, not a glass? Is it a table or is it is
it water or is it vodka?
Yeah, exactly. And you need to have, as a society, a sort of a set of values or ideals or understanding of history that you kind of agree upon, even if there's a diversity of thought within that sort of underpins this idea of truth. And when Hannah Arendt talked about misinformation and the danger of it, and when Russians are actively engaging in this, the goal is not to make you believe that Navalny wasn't poisoned, he had a heart attack. The goal is to bombard you with so many different stories about what happened to Navalny that you are completely overwhelmed and at a certain point throw up your hands and say, I guess we'll just never know what happened to Navalny.
Flooding the zone with
crap.
Right.
And the natural instinct is for everyone to kind of pull away, basically, and give up on the idea that truth exists. And when you give up on the idea that truth exists, you're in seriously deep doo-doo as a society.
The West is following this. Western Europe, the US is following this war closely, it seems. And there's a lot of solidarity also with Ukrainians coming here. You've spent a lot of time in the Middle East, and we'll talk about that later. And I mean, for myself, if I also see how Ukrainian refugees here are being accepted, it's great, and I applaud it, but it feels different from the way Syrians or Afghans have been accepted here, and I'm sure it's not very different in the UK or the US.
Yeah,
Is that something you see the same?
I mean, on the one hand, I see that, 1 million Syrians went into Germany, right, after the horrors that were playing out in that country. And so there was
a lot of fuss about it.
There was a lot of fuss about it. And I definitely think it was not the same kind of a welcome, let's say, that we have seen with Ukrainian refugees. I guess the way that I would try to turn it on its head or focus on it is, look how great it's been to have this wonderful reception to people fleeing their homeland in a time of intense strife. And can't we apply that model to refugees coming from all different conflicts? Because at the end of the day, it's really the same idea there, and also like the idea of like, oh, but culturally this, culturally that. I mean, I love Ukraine, but Ukraine is very different culturally from England too. So it's not. I don't really buy into that argument necessarily. I think it's about exposure and having people more exposed and therefore able to feel more comfortable and find more generosity in their hearts.
Do you see that solidarity and maybe also the interest of the media, which Ukrainians obviously are very afraid of, that especially with the winter starting and the energy prices being raised, that the West will get annoyed, lose interest? CNN is sending you back to Ukraine. That's good.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we're living in a world where we're having a conversation about the specter of nuclear war, which is not something that has been fathomable in my lifetime. So obviously, this is a hugely pressing and important conflict that we all need to be paying attention to. At the same time, you're right, and I know this from every conflict I've ever covered, it is challenging to maintain people's interests, to keep people engaged, particularly if a story starts to feel like it's sort of day in, day out, looks very much the same, sounds very much the same. Now, unfortunately, in some ways, and fortunately in others, the situation in Ukraine is changing very quickly on the ground now, with Ukrainians having huge success with some of these counteroffensives, with the blowing up of the Kerch Strait Bridge, the retaliation for that we saw on Monday, the mobilization in Russia. I mean, things are happening really fast, which I think when that occurs, there's a natural tendency, it's on the front pages again, people are engaged again. But there will come a moment, undoubtedly, in a couple months' time, potentially, where it sort of slows and where, yes, it becomes more of a challenge again to try to keep people focused.
Covering Ukraine also means not covering other crises, other wars, not going to Eritrea or going to other places in Africa or going to Syria. Is that that is sometimes a difficult decision, I suppose?
I mean, I'm very lucky with my position at CNN because, of course, I spent 12 years in Ukraine this year, and I'm about to go back for another few...
12 weeks.
12 weeks. Did I just say 12 years?
It may have felt like 12 years.
Wow. Maybe I should have had that vodka. Yeah, so I spent 12 weeks
we'll get you the vodka.
in Ukraine this year, and I'm going back for another few weeks now. But I also, our team made a point of going to Somalia over the summer because there is almost certainly going to be a famine, and the effects of the energy crisis, the food crisis, inflation, all of that is having a compounded effect on other countries around the world. We went to Pakistan to cover the floods. So I feel in my role at CNN that like part of that responsibility is like, yes, we get that Ukraine is like the most pressing issue right now that the Western world at least is dealing with, but there are a lot of other really important issues going on as well. We need to keep covering them too.
How do you make your, I guess, who makes your travel plans? Do you decide? Does the Bureau decide? Is it a combination of both?
It's a combination. So we will pitch a lot. These are stories we want to do. Can you give us lots of money?
Lots of money.
Lots of money to sometimes wait for months and it doesn't work out, but hey, we tried. And then there's for them, okay, I think I was in Pakistan when the Queen died. Okay, you need to come back to London and cover the funeral.
Why, by the way? Why would you, I mean, with so much shit going on, why would you cover the royal funeral?
Because...
No, I mean... I understand that it needs to be covered. I just feel a little sorry for you that you had to do it.
Yeah, I mean, they did let me say like 2 days, so I got a couple of pieces on from Pakistan. But listen, the Queen dying, I think it's hard to sort of overstate the kind of impact that it did have, I think, in a way that people didn't really necessarily even anticipate. But she was sort of part of the furniture, right? Like everybody grew up with her. She was part of everyone's lives for as long as anyone knew. And so in this kind of moment of, I think, pretty profound anxiety about like where the world's going and the rise of autocracies and the Queen dying, I did feel like it kind of knocked everyone off balance a little bit.
No, I understand, and also I forgot to mention you're half British, so I think I just said something bad.
Yeah, my granny's voice was in my.
Yeah, I know.
Better get back.
I apologize. But obviously it's a big story for the UK. But I understand that it's being covered. But obviously your talents could be used elsewhere.
Oh, and let's be clear, a third
CNN
of
wants your face
Pakistan
on the
was
Queen.
underwater. A
Right.
third of Pakistan was underwater. So, like, this is a huge story. It's a really important story. And these are difficult decisions to make. When you're the chief international correspondent, part of that role is whatever the biggest story is.
You're there.
You're there, and you're representing.
So you don't argue
Not just me. It's
Sure.
it's very much an orchestra.
Right.
But yeah.
In the book you write, there's a scene, I think it's in Iraq, I'm not even entirely sure, where a group of correspondents get together. It is in the Middle East in a war, screaming, war is hell.
Yeah.
They're drinking like hell. And later on, I think it was in Iraq, you say in the book after another bomb blast, wow, it was bad, but I'm addicted.
Yeah.
How does that work? I mean, many crisis correspondents say that.
Yeah.
What are you addicted to?
I think when you start out at a very young age, you're addicted to like the excitement and the adventure, and you feel like you're in a movie because you've never been in a war zone. So
Right.
the only thing you know about war comes from movies and literature. And so it feels sort of glamorous and exciting. And then you usually at some point have a very sobering and serious close encounter with death. And that shifts your frame of focus a little bit and makes you realize that it actually isn't glamorous and it's not exciting. It's horrifying and it's very, very frightening.
But you're still addicted.
But you then become addicted. Well, but I survived and I'm here to tell the story. And what happens when you survive is that you can't really connect to that feeling of fear in that same visceral way you experience. It's like there's a veil between your experience in living it and then the retelling of it. Mm-hmm. But then I sort of got past that too, because I was like, no, I just really don't like being in situations where I feel like my life is genuinely at risk. And then I think now what is very addictive to me is that everything is so vivid in a war zone. You see the worst of humanity, you see the best of humanity.
It's all clear.
It's clear. All this rubbish that fills our lives, and there's a great scene in this movie, The Hurt Locker. It's about a soldier who has PTSD and he goes back from Iraq and his wife sends him out to buy toothpaste and he's in one of these giant American supermarkets and he's looking at like 70 kinds of toothpaste. Mm-hmm. And he's just like, what the hell?
But you're in that supermarket too, last week.
Yeah, no, and I know that feeling of like you come back and you're like, wow, we have like just filled our lives with so much stuff that means nothing, and it's so nice. There is a clarity that comes with war, and a sort of vividness. And that contrast, and yes, the darkness, but also the things that those pearls that shine in the rubble, like they really shine.
Do you think that feeling, which I understand, but will it end, and will there be a time in which you want to host a Sunday morning political talk show?
I don't think so.
Too soon? Too soon.
I tell you what it is as well, honestly. I like talking to ordinary people. Right. I like being in Syria and sitting in the kitchen and having a bunch of women try to teach me how to make kibbeh. Like, God bless them, they never succeeded. And like listening to like their lives and their experiences. I find that more interesting than interviewing a politician, which is not to debase like political coverage in any way or politicians. That's its own field of orbit. But for me, I'm much more interested in the experiences of ordinary people living through extraordinary times.
Right. A little more psychologizing, and then we're done. Another quote from the book, war correspondents are all egomaniacs.
That's from my husband when
that
he
is
first
from
met me.
That is from your husband.
He's a real charmer.
Philip. In his defense, that was the first time you met him.
Yeah.
So he may feel different now. This was at a dinner party in Moscow. He doesn't. Does he? And why did he say so?
No, I tell you what.
And is he right?
He said it to me because I think there's an element of that for sure, okay? Especially historically, it's like the vainglorious war correspondent, the swashbuckling adventurer, this macho kind of character who goes anywhere and everywhere and tells the story at the bar to all his friends. And, you know, I mean, what a lot of nonsense.
Those still exist, right?
They do still exist. There's fewer and fewer of them, but they do still exist. And I do think, though, that there has been a real shift in the industry. And I think that part of that is just having a lot more women in the space. Mm-hmm. And it's just kind of, and also just changes we've seen in society generally. I feel like people who do this job are a bit more low-key now. Right. And also, I think, more empathetic, I hope, to the experiences of the people whose stories they're telling, mm-hmm. as opposed to focusing on their own kind of attributes and successes and near misses, etc. So I think he said that to be provocative and get my attention, and it worked, and now we're married. So, you know, he made his point.
He hardly ever sees you, though.
Well, he does. He sees me more than you'd think, okay. Because...
on the screen.
FaceTime, no. Right. Because I will travel a lot, but then when I'm home, I'm like really home. Right. So, which is sort of nice.
Sure.
And I do try to keep it, like this year has been really crazy because of Ukraine, and I was away for so long. But in general, I really strive to have a decent balance.
Yeah. You just spoke about female war correspondents and how that has changed things a bit. You write about it in the book a bit, not a lot, but you write about how being a woman has affected your work. I think 2 years ago or 3 years ago, I interviewed Christiana Amarpour, who had your job before, and we spoke about this for quite some time, and she said that being a woman correspondent mostly helped her, in the sense that you diffuse situations much easier. Or, well, I mean, in your words, does it help you, or is it more of a blessing than a burden?
I think for me, it's been a blessing. I like to joke that it's sometimes a beautiful thing to be underestimated. Mm-hmm. So I will, you know, go into some house of, I don't know who, jihadists in Syria, and Western male, you know, that's tough. He's a mercenary. He's a spy. Who am I? You're like a really weird lady with a very indulgent husband. Right. So it's not to be said that like you're going to be welcomed with open arms, but I would say traditionally operating in a lot of the places that I have, I'm seen of as less of a threat and more of a curiosity. Mm. I also have access to 50% of the population in parts of Syria, in parts of Afghanistan, that my male colleagues have no access to. They can't go and talk to the women. That's not an option. Right. So that would seem to be hugely important. Sure. And I also find generally, like, sometimes people, if you can get the right space, find it easier to talk to women, especially if you want to talk about something more intimate, more personal, more emotional. Mm-hmm. So for me, I have felt, I mean, it's the only way I know how to be. Sure. But I have felt that it's helped me do the kind of work that I like to do.
How big do you travel? I mean, what group do you travel?
So I've done all of it. So the first time after the revolution in Syria started in 2011, I went in on my own because my producer didn't get a visa. So I just went alone.
Who filmed?
I filmed badly. But it was okay because I was the only person there. So, you know, they were able to salvage it in the edit. So I've done it alone. Then the next time I went with one person who shot and produced everything. But then I've also gone for like a 60-minute shoot, which is this big American news magazine show where you have 2 sound men, 2 cameramen, 1 translator. You know, you have like 2 cars of 14 people. Right. I don't love that, to be honest. I like... Normally, you know, in Ukraine, for example, we're a core team of 3 plus a security guy plus, you know, a Ukrainian producer and driver.
Just 1 security person?
Yeah, that's enough.
Is it also on the further east you go on the front lines? I mean, I've seen CNN in other places where they would travel with a bigger security detail, just to like 4 or 5 in Haiti or other places, just because CNN will take more risks than...
It just depends where you are. I mean, there are places that I go, I went and embedded with the Taliban a few years ago before they took power, when no Western journalists were doing that without getting kidnapped. And it actually was much harder to persuade CNN than it was to persuade the Taliban. But that was a situation where, obviously CNN wanted you to take security, but it was like, that's just never going to happen. Yeah. I can't take a, very nice British former military guy with huge tattoos and like Oakley sunglasses to stay with the Taliban. It's not helping.
What is the policy when it comes to taking risks? I mean, I know it's hard to set one border, but like Reuters, AFP, I think they're like on the front, like in the trenches.
Yeah.
What does CNN do?
I mean, CNN has like very rigorous and very strenuous and often like onerous, honestly, protocols with regards to security, which ultimately is a positive thing, right? Because it forces you, before you undertake any trip or assignment or day trip, whatever it might be, you have to sit there, you have to come up with your plan, you have to locate all the hospitals that are along the route and say, find out how far they are from where you're going. You have to make sure that every license plate has been recorded, that the tires have been checked, that the escape routes have been...
Check in every 2 hours.
Yeah, check in every 2 hours, have your tracker on. I mean, it's endless. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, if you want to do the more dangerous and challenging assignments, then that's the kind of planning and protocols that you need to have in place. The other option is to kind of stay back a little bit, not take that kind of risk, and then you don't have to jump through as many hoops. But then you're further from the story. Sure. So it's a push-pull, and it's different in every conflict zone, and every setting is unique.
And CNN doesn't, though. I mean, sometimes you probably want to go further, or the other way around, but I don't think so, than your bosses at CNN.
Oh, yeah.
Or not? I mean...
Yeah, there are plenty of occasions in general.
And who then decides?
CNN.
I mean, at my station, it will be the station that eventually decides.
Eventually, but it is a two-way. So I'll give you a good example. I was in Afghanistan last summer for 2 weeks when the Taliban took over. And it happened like very suddenly, as in the fall of Kabul, which had not been anticipated to happen that quickly. And of course, pretty much every single, Western TV network went straight to the airport. And we had a big back and forth with CNN. And they ultimately supported us, because I was like, we're not going to evacuate yet. We just spent 3 days with the Taliban in this other province. We're working with this incredibly talented, well-connected Afghan filmmaker, and we feel comfortable operating on the ground here. And so every day it was like, I think you should evacuate. I think you should evacuate. I think you should evacuate. But at the end of the day, I think if you're experienced in the field and you have a good team, ultimately CNN will trust your judgment. And especially with me, because they know that I'm really not that brave, and I'm certainly not crazy. I'm very sensible when it comes to risk.
Before we go
I heard someone laugh there.
No. Before we go to the intermezzo, I want to read something from the book about you covering the earthquake and tsunami in Japan in 2011. You're on the job, obviously. Will he do an interview, I asked, and I then hated myself for it. The poor guy had spent the past 16 hours pulling dead people out of cars. A freak natural disaster had eviscerated his entire community. The last thing he wanted was to have a camera pointed in his face while I questioned him. But you did, since it's your job, put a camera in his face. This happens all the time. How much does it bother you?
Yeah, it's pretty bad. It's the hardest part of the job in general. Is it runs counter to your natural humanity. So, I remember interviewing someone in Syria, a father who had lost his son, and I could only shoot the interview to protect his identity. I just was looking at his hands on his lap, and I was asking him to talk about what happened to his son, and he was really starting to sob, and his hands were, and every part of you as a human wants to put your hand on him and be like, yeah, it's okay, we don't have to talk about this. But I can't do that. I just have to sit there, just let it play out, and just let the moment hang.
What if you wouldn't?
I mean, you know, I think you can still be a human being and do it. You can have some tissues ready to go. You can offer people to take a break. You can give people a hug or squeeze their hand, like off camera. Like, I do think you can be human, but you have to keep reminding yourself that your primary role in that moment is to tell that person's story and share that person's agony with a broader audience so that people can feel connected to a crisis.
But it may hurt him at that particular time more. I mean, you don't ask him, do you want this to be broadcast?
Yeah. Oh, well, you have
in advance, I know.
Yeah.
But I mean,
in advance, you have to, and I always make it clear to people, if there's anything you say that afterwards you feel you don't want to talk about, you know, you wish you hadn't said it, or frankly, if you turn around and you're like, I'm really scared, I wish I hadn't done that, delete it.
Yeah.
That's it. That, for me, is like non-negotiable, and sometimes it pains me to do it because people do change their minds, and it is really tough. But you've got to be a human being. You've got to be sensitive, and especially, I interviewed a 16-year-old girl in Afghanistan who had lived through a horrifying suicide bombing attack on her girls' school and had lost a lot of her friends, managed to live through it, and then the Taliban came and she wasn't able to even go to school anymore. She'd made a decision to go back to school to do it for her dead friends. You know, and you're interviewing this girl and you're like, it's very conflicting. I don't want her to relive trauma, right, in order to like give us a story. So I need to ask the questions in the right way in order to try to minimize that re-traumatizing. So it's a responsibility, definitely.
Well, one more thing on this. There's a book, and I'm sure you know it. Anybody here been raped and speaks English?
Yeah.
It's a memoir from 1978 by Edward Bear, who was a British correspondent. And the title, Anybody Here Been Raped and Speaks English, comes from a BBC reporter who apparently was yelling this in a refugee camp in Congo in the 1960s. The ethics of it, you having... And you write about it in the book that it sometimes bothers you. You have 120 seconds probably to sell a conflict to the world, and it needs to happen. You know, speak English. I mean, it's partly the same question, but CNN is always in a rush. And you write in the book that sometimes it would be better to be a print journalist. You can take more time and.
So I am lucky now that I work at CNN because at CBS I had 90 seconds. And CNN actually, and now in the like privileged role that I have now, they'll give me 7 minutes, 12 minutes, or however long the story needs to be. And I do sometimes envy print people because you can pack a lot of nuance and get into way more detail. But ultimately, I have always felt that television was my calling because I think that when television lands a punch, there's nothing else like it. It is like you get people's attention.
Right.
And people who are not necessarily reading the New York Times every day.
Right. Okay, we'll talk about the Middle East and more in a second, but first we go to an intermezzo. And I would like to welcome Ismail. During dinner I asked him, what's your last name? Because I'll say that on stage as well. And then his answer took about 2 minutes. Big family. So he said, I'll introduce my last name myself. You're a musician. You study at Codarts in Rotterdam. You're going to perform for us, but you'll introduce it yourself. Please, Ismail.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot. So yeah, my name is Ismail Ahmed Abdel Hamid Al-Khalaf Al-Mannawi. I know it is very catchy, and I'm gonna run with it as my artist name. I think it will work. Most of the time in these kind of events, I really don't know what to say because it's so easy that my emotions just take over my mind. And it's like 1,000 words that want to come out at the same time. But talking about conflict, لا للظلم ولا للظالم لن نترك للظلم سبيلا لن نستسلم بل سنقاوم مهما كان الليل طويلا والظالم لا يعرف إلا حقدا وضلالا ودمارا يقتل شيخا يقتل طفلا يلقي فوق الحق ستارا. No for oppressor, neither oppression, and we will fight it, no matter how long the night will get. The oppressors knows only hate, distraction, and darkness. They kill the elderly, the children, and they always try to cover the truth with their dirty cloth. In 2012, I decided with my friend at that time, we were studying at the theater school in Rotterdam, and Rotterdam is just taken over my mind, and it's such a boring city, actually. We were studying at the theater school in Damascus, and we decided to do something about the speech that the president gave about the kids of Daraa. Do you guys know the story about these kids? So in the beginning of the revolution, these children, they went out and they wrote freedom, or we want freedom, on the wall of their school. And their punishment it was to be arrested and take their meals alive. Kids. So for us, seeing a president talking about that with very cold blood, and all what he could do is make jokes, you know. I couldn't do anything because the guy who ordered it, he's actually my brother-in-law, but my sister, she called me, how ridiculous is that? So we decided to do a small musical in the city of Homs. And then I went there, and I stood, and I decided to raise my voice. لا للظلم ولا للظالم لا للظلم ولا للظالم لن نترك للظلم سبيلا لا للظلم ولا للظالم لن نترك للظلم سبيلا لن نستسلم بل سنقاوم مهما كان الليل طويلا الظالم لا يعرف إلا الظالم لا يعرف إلا حقدا وضلالا ودمارا يقتل شيخا يقتل طفلا يلقي فوق الحق ستارا الظالم لا يعرف إلا حقدا وضلالا ودمارا يقتل شيخا يقتل طفلا يلقي فوق الحق ستارا. And that was a crime. I got accused of being a terrorist. I got accused of being a threat for the homeland security by this. Now, I have a question. Did any of you consider this as an act of terrorism? Terrorism. God, English. No? Thank you. War is cold and cruel. But it still happened. But what really makes me mostly sad is children. It's all of these children that they have to pay for nothing. They did not do anything. And there is this song that said, "Oh child, sleep. The universe has went dark. And after you, there's no moon, there's no stars, there's no light, there's no warmth. So sleep and good night." نامي يا صغير، هالكون ابتدى. نامي يا صغير، هالكون ابتدى. من بعدك لا قمر لا نجوم ولا دفا. نامي نامي يا صغيري، نامي نامي نامي. هالكون انطفى من بعدك، لا أمل لا نجوم ولا دفا. من بعدك يا صغير، لا قمر لا نجوم ولا دفا. نامي 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 يا صغير. When I came here, I really don't know what to say. I still really don't know what to say, with all due respect, because these things, they happen almost every day. And a lot of people talk about war, a lot of people write about it, but I still really ask myself, why does it still happen? And is it really necessary? And are we actually changing something here? Or is that enough? Thank you.
Thank you very much. To quote Ismail, and it's hard to disagree, war is cold and cruel. Is there such a thing as a just war?
I think there is such a thing as a just war, but just because a war is just, it doesn't make it any less tragic.
What war was just?
It doesn't. Well, I think a lot of wars start out as just. I mean, if you look at the beginning of the Syrian uprising, I mean, and what started it, the boys in Daraa, who just said, you know, we want freedom, or Ashab Yurid Yusqut al-Nizam, like the people want the overthrowing of the regime. I mean, you can understand how people felt that that was the beginnings of a powerful and just uprising. But what happens almost invariably along the way is that there's so much bloodshed and so much horror and so much grief and anger that everybody starts to lose their humanity a little bit. And things become muddied and murky, and it's no longer easy to look at things in black and white terms. And I think we definitely saw that in Syria, like the nature of the Thawra, the uprising, like it changed a lot over the years. People were beaten down and broken and bloodied and desperate, and there were other actors who were willing to exploit that, whether it was Nusra or Daesh or whoever. And so even though a war can be just, I mean, I think if you ask Ukrainians right now, are they fighting a just war, defending their homeland? Like, I think you would be hard-pressed to find a better definition of a just war in terms of being illegally invaded by an outside country.
I guess it's often when other countries invade, whether it's Iraq or Russia, then people start saying this is an unjust war. Maybe Bosnia you could argue was a just war. When nothing happened in Rwanda, that could have been a just war. But usually the international, when the US interferes, it usually ends even worse, right?
It's very rarely as clear as we want it to be. We have a fundamental desire as human beings for such a clarity and for black and white and yes and no and good and bad, and man, it would make life a lot easier. But part of doing this job is that, like, you live in the gray a little bit. And that is the nature of war. And you see horrors carried out by people you would never have expected that from. And you see moments of heroism from people who are monsters.
Is Ukraine a gray war?
I think that Ukraine, because it was like, an illegal invasion of a country by a far greater outside superpower. I mean, obviously the invasion was unjust, but the Ukrainian response to it and the fight back, I think, I think you'd be hard pressed to find a better definition of a just war.
You're right. Talking about the Middle East, because you empathize with all the victims that you visit in war zones, but a big chunk of the book is dedicated to Syria, and obviously you feel a lot of love for Syria. Why, of all places, does Syria seems to touch you the most, without disregarding the other places? But
well, I mean, you heard Ismail sing, and like the poetry and the sensitivity of the Syrian soul. I mean, I don't want to like generalize an entire people, but Syria is an extraordinary place. I hope that some of you had the opportunity to visit it before the war. It's incredibly beautiful, rich in history and culture and vibrant and diverse, and I just felt like it was one of the most intoxicating, fascinating places I had ever been, and I had also never experienced hospitality like that in my life. Certainly in the West, I think we have a very different idea about hospitality. In my family, we used to joke that guests were like fish, they go bad after a few days. In Syria, like, you go to someone's house and, like, the brother just died, and it's like, you'll take this room and you'll be my guest for as long as you want to be, and I'm going to bring you breakfast and every meal and, cater to your every women need, even though I'm at, like, the lowest point in my entire life.
Wow.
That's hospitality. And I found that profoundly humbling and moving.
You did something, when it comes to Syria, quite uncommon for a journalist. You testified at the UN about the atrocities the Syrian and the Russians did in Aleppo. You were one of the very few Western journalists present there at the time. Let's take a look at a little part of your testimony.
Because the thing that has been killed in Syria, that is much more difficult to rebuild than a bombed-out building, is trust. There is no trust. No trust in the Assad regime, no trust in ceasefires or cessation of hostilities or humanitarian corridors, no trust in the Russians, and no trust in you, by the way, in us, in the international community, who have been wringing their hands on the sidelines while hospitals and bakeries and schools have been bombed, while phosphorus and cluster bombs have killed countless civilians.
And Security Council. Around that time, you also wrote an email to Ben Rhodes in 2016. Ben Rhodes, after Aleppo fell to the regime, Ben Rhodes was the national security guy in the Obama administration. And you accuse him in the email of having no Syria policy, basically, or at least you've spoken out on that. And you write, I think it's a really short email, Dear Ben, I hope you sleep well as Aleppo burns. Thank goodness we have the Russians to sort it all out. That's remarkable for two reasons. First of all, journalists usually don't send these types of messages. It's brave.
I was really mad.
Secondly, well, that was my second point. You really seem to blame the Obama administration for what exactly?
So, first of all, I want to be very clear about that. Like, I crossed the line there. Like, you're not supposed to do that as a journalist. I was mad at the Obama administration not because I was advocating for interventionism, because I have never seen my role as a journalist to be one of advocating for this or that policy, but because from where I was standing, I felt like America's foreign policy in Syria was very dishonest, and that these people had been given the impression that if they were to go out into the streets and march into a hail of bullets, there would be repercussions and support from the international community, and that if chemical weapons were to be used, that would be a red line, and that there would be maybe not some form of justice, but at least some form of staying true to your word and the standards that you set for yourself. And also from the beginning, this kind of Assad must go, Assad must go. Well, I believe it was the great late President Lyndon Johnson who said, never tell a man to go to hell unless you can make him go there. And the same thing really applies for, like, when you're saying, like, Assad must go, if you're not willing to do anything to make Assad go, then you should probably shut up about that, because a lot of people are going to die because they think you have their back and that you're going to support them in making that happen. So that's why I was mad about that. And I also was just going through a really tough time in my life because I had spent so much time in Syria. I was so consumed by it. I was so heartbroken and devastated by it that I was honestly in kind of a depression.
Right.
So.
Did he reply?
No. But he got the email.
How do you know?
He's mentioned it a couple times on podcasts. He was like, she knows she crossed the line.
Oh, really? So he mentioned it at a podcast, but Coward never responded.
The best was that someone actually, who obviously hadn't read my book, was like, when his book came out, they were like, I'm having you as a moderator in a discussion with him. And I was like, have you run that by Ben yet? And they were like, no, but I'm sure he'll be thrilled. I'm like, well, sure enough, an email comes back a week later. So I think actually we're just going to do this as a solo event. I was like, yeah, I could have told you that.
I wish I was there. About Iraq, you write in the book, compounded by the guilt of being American, I guess semi-American, how many lives had been destroyed by this senseless invasion? Was there a sense of guilt, and did being American make your job in Iraq, but maybe in other places too, more difficult, actually doing the job with people realizing you were American, or did you use your British accent?
No, I mean, I use my British passport a lot because, it's marginally less hated.
Well,
but the emphasis really on marginally.
Past years, well.
I think it was a really difficult time to be an American, and there's a big difference, when you live in the U.S. and you read about foreign policy and you watch it on the news, that's one thing. And then it's another thing to actually go and live in people's countries and understand that there's a giant chasm often between the way America sees its role in the world and the way the rest of the world sees its presence in their various countries. And so that is, for any young American, I think, a really humbling thing to experience up close, and it can be really painful as well, because you're also spending time with the U.S. military, for example, in Iraq, and seeing that, there are a lot of really fine young American men with really good intentions who have been sort of corralled into this, ultimately what I felt was, a really misguided mission from the get-go, and so many people died as a result, and ultimately I think we feel the sort of the ripple effects of how the entire region was destabilized, and the sort of fundamental makeup of the region was recalibrated in a way that we're still feeling the sort of aftershocks of that today.
And does it often happen when you're working in the Middle East that people you talk to approach you more as an American than as a journalist, in the sense that they are mad?
I have had a lot of people
time?
just want to come and shout, and I'm like, all right, just get it out of your system.
Right,
You know?
right.
And I get it, and like that's part of being a journalist, whether you're American or not. It's not, you basically, if you work for CNN, like to everyone in the Middle East, you're an American journalist anyway, right? Because you're representing an American network. Right. And part of, in the same way that it's my job to sit there in your moment of grief and tell your story, it is also my job to stand there in your moment of rage and just, let it rip. I mean, that's part of it.
Right. 9/11 obviously was a big event, nevertheless, but in your life as well, because as I said in the introduction, that's when you decided you wanted to be a journalist, also because, as you write in the book, you wanted to understand where the rage came from. So have you gotten to learn to understand more of that, or has the world only become more complicated?
No, I think I understand. I do think I understand human nature a lot better, and I understand how wars happen and why wars happen.
But rage against the US and US foreign policy of going back decades, is that something you understand more now?
Yeah, of course.
I mean, the Dutch have fought war. I mean, we've done nasty shit, but...
No, I do understand that. I mean, look, I was in Afghanistan one year and 2 months ago, at the end of a 20-year occupation, and people are coming up to me and begging for help to get out of the country and sobbing because their daughters won't be able to go to school or have the kinds of jobs that they had dreamed of for them, and feeling like they were sold a dream that they're no longer allowed to have, and feeling anger, and and again, it's like you have to open your eyes to things that are painful and uncomfortable and challenge the way you view yourself and the way you view where you come from. And that is part of being a good journalist. And it's not even necessarily about being American or not. It's about being willing to put your ego and your preconceptions away at the door and sit and really listen to people and understand that their experience of the world, rightly or wrongly, is very different than yours. And that's the fundamental job, right? Is trying to explain to you why the view there is so different, and allowing you to connect with that reality in a way that makes it more accessible, and that hopefully, in an ideal world, allows people to kind of talk and experience each other's versions of reality more, and make less harsh judgments about them.
You're also very interested in the book. It shows in these young men from the West with a Muslim background who go to Syria to, and eventually join the Islamic State or other groups. And you write about Yilmaz, a Dutch, Turkish man.
He's Dutch. I forgot that.
Yeah, he's Dutch and Turkish.
Yeah.
He's been interviewed a few times by you as well.
Yeah.
And you write about the disappointment many of these men must have felt looking at the war in Syria. Have you gotten to understand, which is obviously something different than agree with the decisions they have made, but have you gotten to understand better that they joined, guys from London where you live, that they joined these radical groups?
Yes, I do. Hannah Arendt talked about the banality of evil. And I think the sort of ISIS phenomenon is a really good illustration of that, because you expect there to be, this kind of extraordinary quality to evil. And actually what you see more often than not is that it's quite mundane. And I think with a lot of these young guys, I mean, Yilmaz is just one example, it's not dissimilar from joining a gang, right? It's about feeling a sense of belonging, about having value, about connection, dignity, so many complicated factors, and there isn't a one-size-fits-all. But what you do realize is that once you kind of immerse yourself in that world a little bit more, you can quite easily see how at that moment in time, with Syria raging, with the horrors on all of our screens, it was like a perfect storm. And you were going to have a lot of young guys who were probably initially attracted to the just war component and wanting to defend people who were being slaughtered, but then very quickly got suckered into something, you know, dark beyond belief. And the problem with war is that if you haven't experienced it before, you have no idea what you're getting into. And once you do experience it, you become desensitized to it. And so the longer...
There's hardly a way out.
And so the longer you are there, the darker your soul is getting. No matter how good a person you think you are. It's just the reality.
The last clip I wanted to go to, and then we'll talk a little bit more. You went to Myanmar last year, where there's a bloody war going on between the military junta and civilian groups. Before we talk about it, let's look at a brief clip.
We have a CNN exclusive this morning. Remarkable access inside Myanmar, which is in the midst of a bloody military coup. One advocacy group says at least 550 people have been killed in the past 2 months. Protests continue. They did throughout the weekend, which security officials have been responding to with this brutal crackdown, detaining thousands. At least 11 people were arrested Friday, minutes after being interviewed by CNN. Our Clarissa Ward joins us now live from Myanmar with the permission of the military, who we do want to note is escorting our team. So, Clarissa, what's happening now? Tell us why it's so important for you to be there.
Well, as you said, John, 2 months ago, a democratically elected government was overthrown by the military in a coup after the military suffered what can only be described as a humiliating defeat in the elections back in November.
The anchor, John, I forgot his last name.
Berman.
John Berman, he said, we have a CNN exclusive, and you started to laugh, or not?
Oh,
Was that unintentional? Okay.
No, that was unintentional.
Okay. Well, I was going to go into that, so I thought that would be
We did have a tendency for a while to call a lot of things exclusive.
Yeah.
That genuinely wasn't exclusive.
Yeah. Well, is it? Because the reason I bring this up also is because it's been quite a controversial trip.
Yeah.
You got a lot of applause for going there, obviously.
Yeah.
That as well. But also quite a bit of criticism,
Yeah.
for instance, by independent journalists from neighboring countries, also for pretending this was a big international exclusive, even though there were foreign journalists from other countries there, small countries like Bhutan.
There were journalists from Bhutan covering Myanmar.
Right.
I did not know there were journalists from Bhutan covering Myanmar, but
well, I mean, it's not that important, but I mean, they did get upset because what they believed they saw was obviously what's been called parachute journalism, big international stars being flown into the country for a week or less, doing their thing without, and instead of maybe letting local journalists do the job in front of the camera. What is your response?
My response is that, first of all, like, we rely 100% on the reporting of local journalists. Like, we can't do anything without them. They are the bravest, they are the boldest, they are in the trenches day in, day out, and they are the backbone. And so I have nothing but tremendous respect for them. The reality is, though, that if I am trying to tell a story to an international audience or to an American audience in particular, with CNN being, a US network, it is going to be easier for me as an American to get that attention focused on Myanmar if I am there than it is if that journalist is on the ground. Now, and also, to be honest, because of security considerations, like, you couldn't put Myanmar journalists on television from Myanmar. I had a measure of protection precisely because I am a white Western journalist who was coming in just for 1 week. I had a measure of protection. So I could ask harder questions. I could be ruthlessly critical in a way that honestly would probably cost a local journalist potentially their life, or certainly would result in them being imprisoned. So I view that as being a position of great privilege. to be able to like put a lot of attention and a spotlight on Myanmar for that time that I'm there, and to have that modicum of protection afforded to me because I work for CNN. And so I view it as a real responsibility, yeah.
A couple of the citizens you spoke to were arrested.
Yeah.
Most of them were later released, but I don't think all.
They were all released.
They were all released.
Yeah. The ones who we talked to were all released.
Right,
yeah.
But it's still, is that a dilemma? Because you know that could happen?
So, I mean, first of all, I would say I never expected people just to start coming up to us and, you know, doing the sign of the revolution. I mean, that just never, I've never seen bravery like that.
Because that occurred
I'm surrounded by the military and by the police. So it never occurred
That's what happened. They would come up to you and...
I mean, because in the beginning, they wouldn't really let us go around. And then I was like, can we just see a market? I just would like to get some video of like life. There's no, we hadn't really been allowed into Yangon. So they were like, fine, we'll take you to a market. We go to a market, we turn on our camera, and within 2 minutes, people just start coming up. And then they all start banging their pots and pans like crazy. The whole market, and people just start running in. And of course, we all looked at each other and we're like, okay, this is an intense situation because, you know, this could be dangerous for these people, obviously. And we were saying to them very clearly, look, we're surrounded by security services. We are here.
Get out of here.
But they had a message that they wanted to deliver and that they wanted the world to hear. And is it my job as a journalist to be like, no, I know better than you do what's good for you. I'm going to censor you and not deliver your message. And by the way, you're still going to jail because the guy was there and saw you anyway. So no, what we did, we let them have their say. We told them to calm, you know, there was a sense at one stage that it could turn into like a protest almost. And it was like, do not do that. We left after a few minutes. And then we boycotted every event that the junta tried to get us to go to until they were all released.
Right.
So,
which they were eventually.
Which they were. Yeah. It's not an ideal situation, obviously, as a journalist. You're at the center of the story, and people are putting themselves in you know, positions of real vulnerability because you're there. And so that's always uncomfortable as a journalist. But ultimately, I still think there was like a hugely powerful report. And I'm really glad that we did it because I feel like the people of Myanmar deserve to have their story told and have their voices heard.
The only way to get in was obviously with the permission of the Myanmar, of the junta.
Yeah.
And it had been written, but I don't know if this is true, but you may know that it had been arranged by, I think, a businessman who was a lobbyist for the junta and was being paid by the junta as well.
Yeah, I don't think he ever got paid.
Okay, but did it feel like you were being part of a PR campaign, which is something different than the result may have been not PR, but was the intention of the junta to let you in?
I think
they wanted a good story out.
I don't know what the junta thought the result was going to be of letting us in, because to be honest, I think it was pretty clear that they were not going to get a good news story out of this. So it's hard for me to know what went on behind closed doors in terms of how they were persuaded to do it. But I will say again, this is as a journalist, like we're constantly like, do we get Iran visas? And we have minders all the time. When we get visas, I mean, not me, but my colleagues who go to Syria, you know, with the Assad regime, like we're constantly getting visas from either corrupt, authoritarian dictatorships, you know, tyrants, who will try to curtail your movements, tell you what you can do and what you can't do, what you can show and you can't show. And ultimately, I think the vast majority of journalistic outlets come out on the side of like, it's still better to go.
To be there.
To be there, be on the ground, see it, understand that you are not seeing a full picture, but at least you can sit down and ask some of these people to give an accounting for their actions.
And during the live shot, you can obviously say what you want.
Yeah, I mean, it was awkward. They were all standing right there like, I can't believe she's really saying this, but, you know, it was...
She said it. Yeah.
But, yeah.
Just one more thing on parachute journalism, because you're aware of the discussion. And this is a quote from Dina Abu Ghazala. She works for Al Jazeera in Egypt. And she writes, this was, I think, last year, the prevalent model in international media's coverage of the global south is that local journalists' role is largely limited to fixers. We spoke about that. We never seem to question why Western media outlets choose to send their own reporters and employ so-called fixers in the global south to provide translation, setting up interviews, and quite often provide crucial local insights and access to characters without whom the story wouldn't work. Why is it okay for international media outlets to use the expertise of locals to publish or broadcast a report under a Western correspondent's name instead of investing in locals to tell their own stories? I think you gave part of the answer.
Yeah.
But it's still a valid point in a sense.
It is.
You're basically saying I'm the megaphone. CNN is the megaphone, which makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
You have a stage that they don't, but it's still...
It's not just that you have a stage, it's that you know how to tell a story to your audience. Okay, I'm not going to pretend that I know how to tell a story to the audience of South Sudan, right? And that I'll know the most compelling language and comparisons and way to present that story. Right. But I have a pretty good sense of how to tell a story to Americans, to make them care, to make them pay attention, to make them be engaged. I also think there is a really important point underlying this, which is, first of all, those local journalists should always get a byline. Right. Right?
Which they do always, at CNN.
Yeah.
Unless it brings them in danger.
Unless it brings them in danger, they always would. And by the way, there are many situations, that we have at CNN bureaus where there are local journalists who are the correspondents covering various countries around the world. So there needs to be, obviously, more diversity and a more vibrant ecosystem with more voices, and particularly the voices of people on the ground being amplified. But to me, it's not so much that like one needs to be at the expense of the other. Like you're working together and acting in concert to try to tell a fuller and broader story to a wider audience, ideally.
And apart from the ethics of it, or whatever you want to call it, and your point is very clear, but you used to live in Moscow for a while and in Beijing, where you were a stand-in for Uma Thurman at the Kill Bill film, but we spoke about that. So you lived there for a couple of years and you really get to know a place. Now it's still, whether you call it parachuting or something else, you're there for a week, or in this case, Ukraine, you were there for 12 weeks. But do you always have a sense that you have a real good grip on the story? Because if they fly me into Pakistan right now, no matter how many good local journalists I work with, I still would have a sense that I don't really know the story. I would be afraid to make mistakes.
I know what you mean, and I would just say that, like, after doing this for 20 years now, there are many stories that I feel relatively experienced with, whether it's Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Middle East, Russia, Ukraine, China, although like it's been a long time since I've been able to go back to China. So you feel that what you have are like the basic sort of foundations of understanding the story. And then, yes, there is an element when there's a big news story that happens of like having to read in and read up and make sure that you're on top of your game. But there will also be things that will happen where I will say, I'm not an expert on that. And so I'm not going to go and pretend that I'm an expert on, the troubles in Northern Ireland, right? I'm not.
But if new troubles occur in Northern Ireland, CNN will send you there. You would have to pretend that you are an expert.
They would probably send Nick Robertson first, who's covered that story.
Well, Nick, let's assume Nick has COVID.
You don't know Nick. Nick would still go, man.
Now you're forcing me to say, what if Nick is not around anymore? Poor Nick.
No, I listen. I do take your point, and it is.
I'm a TV.
It's one of the stresses of the job, of course. Sure. It's a lot of responsibility.
Do you sometimes feel unsure about whether what you're saying is true? Or I'm sure it's true, but it's backed up enough by.
See, I think I am smart enough to be humble about what I don't know. And I'm not going to try to pretend to anyone when I'm on television that I'm an expert on everything in the world. I'm not. And so there will be plenty of times covering the Queen's funeral. I don't normally cover the royals. Okay, this is a very different sort of thing to what you're talking about, but like I'm not an expert on the royals. So I was happy to sit there during these panels and be quiet a lot and to chime in when I felt like there was a moment where there was something to say or contribute. I don't need to dominate just because my role says I'm Chief International Correspondent.
Right.
You know, if I can enhance the coverage in some way, that's great, but I am not the sort of authority on every topic, not by any stretch of the imagination.
You're doing a great job. Let me finish with one other quote from the book, and then we'll go to the audience. You're writing, I didn't realize that I would have my heart broken in 100 different ways, that I would lose friends by being a war journalist and watch children die and grow to feel like an alien in my own skin. I didn't understand that the privilege of witnessing history came at a price. What price? And has it always felt like it was worth the price?
I think it's always felt like it was worth the price. But the price is that you don't do this job for 20 years and not absorb some of what you witness and not take on that sadness and that grief and not experience it on a personal level when people who you're friends with or who you cross paths with are ultimately killed or tortured or any number of horrifying outcomes. Nobody gets to just like coast through and do this and not have to pay the bill at some point. Like, you know, and I always tell that to young journalists. I'm like, you have to be aware, like at some point the check's coming and you don't know when it's going to come. So you just got to be ready for it because it will come. And so you have to be vigilant about self-care. You have to be, really, to the best of your ability, open, at least with someone in your life, about what you're going through and experiencing, and making sure that you have outlets available to you to get you through it.
And you've done that because you write in the book that you've used therapy as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, whether it's therapy, yoga, prayer, wine, although I recommend that less, there's a lot of very good ways to take care of yourself, but you have to be proactive about it. No one else is going to do it for you.
And how long do you foresee yourself doing this?
I don't really know. I just don't think I'd be very good at anything else. So.
Okay. Let's go to audience questions. Questions, not meaning essays, that have been rejected by the op-ed pages of the Volkskrant because they were long and boring. Sorry, I have to say that. I used to have a colleague here who said if your question takes longer than 10 seconds, there are snipers on the balcony. But given the topic tonight, I don't think that's a very good joke. Who has a question for Clarissa? Over there. Lady in the middle. Yeah.
I expected to have a lot of hands raised, so I have a question for your current trip to Ukraine, because you covered the story a couple of months ago, if I'm right, when the war just started. What is your primary goal now to tell the world with going there and reporting from the current events?
I think my primary goal is twofold. First of all, to look at the recent escalations on the Russian side, whether that's this sort of endless barrage of missiles that we saw raining down on various Ukrainian cities at the beginning of the week, or whether it's troop movement, heavy troop movement into Belarus, kind of pushing down towards where they had been at the beginning of the war near the Kyiv in the north, and what that portends, if anything. And then I'm also very interested in following some of these counteroffensives that the Ukrainians have been really very successful with. There's a particular part of Ukraine in the south called Kherson, which is under Russian control, which if the Ukrainians were able to take that back would be like massively significant. So I'll be watching that closely. And then honestly, it's just like being in a place, talking to people, breathing the air, feeling the sort of atmosphere, and just trying to give a sense of like what life is like for Ukrainians right now.
You go with a set plan, or like the first story is in your head and then you'll see?
You have to be a little flexible
Sure.
in general because the situation is so fluid. Often you go in with a very set plan, but in this instance,
It's tough.
yeah.
Okay. Other questions? Over there, the gentleman on the third row. Yeah, fourth row.
I was just wondering, previously CNN has Warner as the owner, and now Discovery as the new owner of CNN.
Yeah.
I was wondering, is there any positive or negative aspect on the journalism culture at CNN?
So, and the thing I will say about our new owners is that they are very supportive of the journalism that we do, and I think they view it as like a real jewel in the crown. And they care a lot about particularly the work that we've been doing this year at CNN International. So there's always going to be changes when you have a new parent company, but for the most part, I think everybody feels really gratified that there is like a huge amount of support for news gathering, which is, you know, difficult, dangerous, costly, and many other things.
Thank you. Other questions? Over here. Yeah. I'm just going to make you walk up and down.
Yes, thank you so much for your very inspiring talk and also for the super important work that you're doing. I have a question which may seem a bit like a cliche, but I'd still like to really hear your answer, which is, do you still believe in peace if you've seen so many wars? And if so, how will we get there?
I don't think you're going to like my answer.
It's a good question.
It is a good question. I don't. I believe that war is a sort of inherent part of the human condition, or a sort of byproduct of the human condition. I do think that the ways we fight wars, with the exception of Ukraine, are changing a lot. Traditionally, there were huge amounts of casualties in wars. If you look back to like the First World War, the Second World War, so there have been like some positive trends, I guess, in the sort of nature of warfare. Sadly, I think what we see in Ukraine again are like really high casualty rates on both sides, mostly of soldiers, but also of civilians. So I do not hold out hope for world peace per se, no, but I am hopeful that we can find better ways to hurt each other without killing masses of civilians. That doesn't sound...
That sounds like going on Twitter.
Warm and fuzzy.
No casualties. Thank you. That was a good question. Over there. Yeah.
You've seen a lot of conflicts all over the world. There are people arguing that a civil war is brewing in America. If you've seen the mechanisms of war elsewhere, how worried are you about the current situation in America?
You know, I am worried. I am worried because all wars usually start when people begin dehumanizing each other and they stop communicating and they really become entrenched in their echo chambers and they start talking about the other as, you know, whatever it might be, subhuman, basically. And that is a very slippery slope. And also from where I'm standing, on my sort of global perch, traveling around the world, I still see that there's a lot more that unites Americans than that which divides them. I wish Americans could see that. I'm like, it's really sort of funny to me because a lot of places I travel in the world, nobody's making a big distinction between Republicans and Democrats. Right. So I think it's easy to forget that, and I think it's hard sometimes for Americans to appreciate because it's been so long since they've fought a war on their soil. And that also is dangerous because people who have experienced war are much more likely to do whatever they can to prevent it from happening again.
But if we see you live from the US, it will be bad news.
It'll be bad news. I really, really very much hope it doesn't come to that.
Thank you. I can't choose. Well, he's making noise too, so let's go.
Thanks. Oh, you hold it, right, sorry. There's a funny scene in Anchorman where all the news networks get together and have a fight.
Yeah, it's awesome.
With each other.
Love it.
Does that...
Dorothy Mantooth is a saint.
Yeah, exactly. Does that exist in war zones or that competitive nature, or do news networks, do you have each other's backs?
You have each other's backs.
Okay.
I mean, there is always like a little bit of competitive nature, but that is a big part of what I do love about this work is like all that silliness. It's like if someone needs a ride, you're giving them a ride. If someone needs food, you're giving them food. If someone is in trouble, God forbid, you're going to spend all night working the phones with them to try to help them out of their situation. And, I've had friends kidnapped and friends killed in Ukraine, and whether it's Fox News or NBC or whoever or whatever it is, it doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is looking out for each other.
Over there, the lady in the middle.
I have a question about this cliche that in war, the first thing that dies is truth. I don't really agree, I guess. And I was wondering how you feel about it, because you also said in the beginning that you do believe in truth.
I do believe in truth. Yeah, I do believe in truth. And I think like when you think of what that expression means, it means that like every side relies heavily on propaganda, right? And propaganda is a really powerful and important tool for keeping morale high, for recruitment, for external support. And you'd be really naive to think that, only one side engages in propaganda and not the other side. Everyone engages in it. But, there's other kinds of truth that emerge in war that aren't necessarily the truth of any one nation state or government, but are kind of more human truths that I think all of us can tap into and feel connected to, which is a big part of this job, honestly, is like trying to focus on those and with the hopes that they will resonate to an international audience, because maybe you've never been to Afghanistan, but like you can feel connected to that truth.
Thank you. One more over there, and then we'll go to the front.
I'm here currently with 5 of my classmates, and we're studying journalism.
Awesome.
And I was wondering if you had to start all over again today.
Oh, gosh.
Would you choose again for journalism right now?
Would I choose to do this again?
Yeah.
Oh, 1,000%.
Even in the current state of the world?
Yeah. I really don't know how to do anything else.
You've tried acting.
That was like before I even left university, and I would not be good at that now. So I love my job, and I really view it as an incredible privilege to be able to travel and connect with people and tell their stories. And I can't think of a better job. It's not an easy job. It's not for everyone, but I wouldn't change it for the world.
Great. I think there was a question here. Yeah.
Thank you for coming and speaking candidly. My question has to do with news as a consumptive product. So you work for a for-profit news outlet.
Mm-hmm.
How do you reconcile what is news and belongs to, let's say, a global commons, just be free, and the profit or cost side of the production of news?
So, do you mean like, well, let me sort of put the question back to you. Do you mean to say that you find though to be something like fundamentally at odds with the ethics of news?
I'm asking if you do.
No, I don't think so. I don't think so, only because, well, first of all, because I see how other models work. You have the BBC, where like their money comes from the state. You have Al Jazeera, where their money comes from another state as well. So state-run models are not, there's advantages to them, sure, but there's also distinct disadvantages to them. on other levels. There's no, I don't think, like perfect utopian way of doing this work. But I will say from experience that it's very expensive work to do, and this feeds in a lot about the question you were asking about, who goes to cover what stories, et cetera. Like, it's really expensive to take 2 weeks to go to Afghanistan or whatever it might be and shoot stories and edit them and put them on television. And that requires a lot of money. And also, as a journalist, like, you want your stories to be seen in as many places as they possibly can, which usually, it translates into viewers, and viewers usually translates into more money, which then translates into bigger budgets. So obviously there has to be I don't think any of us ever think about it like when we're going out in the field, like, wow, if we do a great story, there'll be mega no one's thinking like that. And there's a real separation of church and state in terms of, the news gathering operation as opposed to like features or the business side of it. But it's not something I feel conflicted about. I think I would maybe if there was more pressure, like do that story, because that story will be, a big one for, that would be more uncomfortable, but we don't have that.
Great. Gentleman over there. Yeah. Well.
Yeah. Hi. In terms of like your practice as a journalist, how does, if it does, how does humor play a role?
That's a good question. I mean,
yeah.
So what people don't realize about war zones, but all of you will realize once you read my book, which is on sale in the lobby.
They all have.
So I don't think you can really do this kind of work if you don't have humor and camaraderie, like as a team. Because what the movies don't show you about war is that 90% of war is waiting around for things to happen and like killing time and trying to get a ride to someplace or trying to get access to something or waiting for a story to unfold or waiting for any number of things. So there's a huge amount of killing time. And there is also a huge amount of okay, we just saw something really dark, but none of us are in a place right now where we can afford to go there emotionally because we're still in the zone. So, that's where gallows humor comes in. I don't know what the Dutch translation of that would be, but there is a kind...
I want you to pronounce it, galgenhumor.
Galgenhumor. And also I have found as well, when you go to spend time in some of these places that have been at war for a long time, the Iraqis have the darkest sense of humor ever. And that is also kind of a beautiful thing and is really instructive in terms of shaping your understanding of how different people approach conflict and deal with stress and trauma. So yes, it's not an obvious bedfellow, but humor is definitely very much part of the picture.
Thank you. Where's Katul? Yeah, there. Gentleman over here. Apologies to everybody else.
Hi. For the students over there, and maybe for the rest of us, people aspiring to be good journalists or good reporters, what would your single best piece of advice be?
Well, first of all, can I just say I'm so excited that there are so many people here who want to be journalists. This is great. My single piece of advice would be curious and listen. I feel like as a society, in general, we don't really, we're certainly in America, we're not big on listening. We'll do that thing where but we're just waiting to talk. You really need to listen. You need to listen to people. You may hate what they're saying. You may disagree with it. It doesn't matter. Just listen. It's not going to hurt you. We're getting a little precious now, I think, these days about I can't hear that. That's a microaggression. That's going to upset me. If you want to be a journalist, it's your job to listen and be curious and be challenged. And that is okay. You can still have your values. No one's asking you to compromise those. But you need to be able to keep an open mind, and you need to be able to listen, and you need to be fundamentally curious about the world and about people. And you guys will kick ass. I can't wait.
That's great advice. Thank you. Nobody in the back wants a question? Then we'll go to him. Yeah. Oh, sorry. It's live. This happens.
So I was wondering, what story did you not cover that you really wanted to cover?
I would really, really like to be in Iran right now. It's a heartbreak that I can't get a visa and that, none of us can get visas at the moment. So that is a story I would love to be covering.
How does CNN cover Iran right now?
Well, we've had, there's been phases where we've been able to get visas. I've been before. My colleague Fred Pleitgen goes regularly, Nick Payton-Walsh.
Right now, what's
right now we put in like all these applications, and you don't get an answer. You don't get a rejection. You just don't get an answer.
So what's on CNN right now?
Okay,
Iran
so we have like
social media.
Yeah, Jemana Karadja is covering it from Istanbul. We have different people who are playing into the coverage. Nadia Bashir in London, going through all the social media stuff, and
it's frustrating.
It's really frustrating because you're only getting a sliver of the picture.
Okay, over here was a question. Yeah.
You talk a lot about wanting to reach a wide audience. Meanwhile,
a wide audience.
Yeah, wide.
Yeah,
yeah sorry.
Not a white. Are you trying to get me canceled?
I understood you correctly. Sorry. Meanwhile, the media ecosystem in the US has become more polarized. I think. Is this something you think about while doing your reporting? Like, how can I maybe go against that and reach people who maybe only watch Fox News or,
Well, I don't think of it in a sort of like very intentional way like that, because then you're already playing that game of trying to make it, your coverage one way or another. I just really try to call it like I see it. And so in Afghanistan last summer, for example, the Biden administration was not happy with me. Ted Cruz was not happy with me. I'm like, if everybody's kind of unhappy with me, then I'm probably doing my job well. Because it's not in my interest even to kind of cater to the interests or agenda of any one side politically. My job is to tell the stories of the Afghan people that I'm meeting on the street and give, a light to their experience. And that really is the only thing that motivates me. And all the rest of it, honestly, is just noise. And I worked at Fox, and there are good reporters who work at Fox. There's a lot of noise, but there are a lot of good reporters. So I just try to put all that stuff out of my head and, not look at Twitter when I'm in these places and focus on doing the justice to the story that I'm there to do. And if I piss everybody off in the process, then I've done well.
Just briefly, you say the Biden administration was not happy. Do they let you know or let the station know?
No, but there were a couple of tweets from, maybe it's not for,
You didn't watch Twitter, you said.
Oh, no, this was after.
Oh, okay.
Once I leave, I obsess over Twitter because I'm like, why am I not there anymore? Let me dive in again. There were a couple of tweets that were saying that I was too critical or whatever it might be from Democratic senators. Fair enough. It's just,
Fair game. Okay. The lady over there.
You talked about how much you love Syria. Do you think that has ever been in conflict with your objectivity as a journalist?
Yeah, probably. But at least I can own it. No, I think the reality is when you're covering war, and if you're a news organization, this is why it's really important to have lots of people involved in your coverage who are covering different sides of it. Because when you're on the ground and you're with the people you're with and living vicariously through their experiences, like obviously there's going to be a bias because you're like living through their lens. And I don't think that that is entirely problematic as long as you are A, aware of it, and B, have somebody on the other side with the Assad regime or with the Russians or whoever it might be, telling that side of the story and giving humanity to that side of the story too. So it is a myth, I think, this idea of like complete neutrality as journalists. Like, we're not the UN, and that's not the role that I think we're there to do. We're there to make stories real for you and to convey the full horror of any given scenario.
Does that mean, sorry to interrupt, does that mean you always choose the side of the victims?
No.
I mean...
No, usually I just choose the side of where you get the visa first. I mean, I'm just kidding.
But after that, I mean, it would be choosing the side of the victims. Is that something bad?
But I wouldn't say it's that. I would do anything to go to Russia right now.
Right.
I would do anything to go to Russia if I could get a visa, to cover what's happening there, to see critics coming out publicly of Putin, to see this mobilization, to see lines 20 kilometers long of people queuing up to get out of the country. I mean, I would desperately want to see that, to talk to Russian people about, you know, their perceptions of Ukraine.
They're taking visa again, or can you not enter because of the Navalny investigation?
I haven't been able to get a visa since the Navalny investigation. But they're also only allowing people to go now who have, like, you know, we have CNN people who can go, but they're a very small group of people who have been based in Moscow. Okay. So it's, you know, I can go on either side. It doesn't have to be, you know, good guys, bad guys, victims, you know, war criminals. And that's why it's important to have journalists covering all sides.
We have time for 2 more questions, or one if it's a really long one. Over there, the lady, yeah. And then one in the back somewhere.
So you've been working for over 20 years in the field. Of course, you need to have some sort of healthy balance between how engaged you get, but I cannot imagine that it doesn't in one way, shape, or form influence your own identity, or maybe your politics, or maybe your values, or maybe even how you raise your children. So I'm interested in understanding, how has your work shaped you when you don't have to be a journalist?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think, like, you know, there's obviously a lot to unpack with that, and it ripples across many different layers. But I think if I had to sort of put a sort of bow on it, I guess it would be, I'm much more cautious about assuming that I know more than other people know, that I'm more educated than other people are, that I have a better understanding of the world than other people do. I just feel like it's been a profoundly humbling experience doing this job for 2 decades. And I'm constantly learning, and I'm constantly having to wrestle with ideas that I thought I knew about the world. But that doesn't mean that you lose, like, your kind of like fundamental compass. I do feel like that gets stronger even. But being okay with not always knowing and not always having answers, and taking things one step at a time and listening to people.
Thank you. Is there a last question? In the back somewhere, maybe, because we've been up front. No, everybody happy? Everybody happy? Over here? Oh, okay.
Last but not least.
Yeah. That was good. Sorry, time's up. It's stomach.
I was just wondering, because you talked about how being a woman in your field and to the places that you go can be an advantage to you. But I was also kind of curious if you've been in any situation where it was actually a disadvantage to you, and if there would be any kind of things you would do in order to kind of overcome those disadvantages in a certain way, or if you would just then, in those circumstances, decide that would not be the story that you would cover and do it in a different way.
You said being a woman as a reporter, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's situations where you're very vulnerable to sexual assault, and that is something that plagues you. And I have colleagues who have been assaulted doing this work, female colleagues. So that's definitely something that is in your mind and you think about, and you try to take the best precautions you can. But there is a randomness to rape and assault, particularly in a conflict arena. It's really nothing to do with how you dress or how you look or anything like that. So I don't want to sound cavalier about being a woman, because I do recognize that, particularly for women who live in conflict zones, sexual assault and rape are horrifying realities that are part of their daily life in many cases. So I would say that's the one thing that is where I do recognize that you have to be humble and very cautious, and that there is that threat.
Thank you so much. We have to leave it at this. The book is on sale. The bar is open. I want to thank Ismail. Thank you for your story and your performance. That was wonderful.
Thank you so much, Ismail. It was so good.
If you're not done applauding, I really enjoyed our conversation. Good luck in Ukraine. Thank you, Clarissa Ward.
Oh, thank you.
That was fun. Thanks a lot.